The city was dying. Berlin in April was not a city anymore but a shell, a skeleton of what it had been. The streets were full of broken glass, fallen bricks, and smoke that hung in the air like a curtain. At night, the sky glowed red from fires that never stopped burning. Russian artillery shells fell almost every minute, shaking the ground, sending dust down from the ceilings of underground bunkers where frightened people hid. The once proud German capital was crumbling, and inside the ruin sat a man who had ruled almost all of Europe just a few years earlier. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany, was now trapped underground in a grey, cold bunker beneath the Chancellery Garden. The bunker was small, cramped, and smelled of damp concrete, sweat, and stale air. This was to be his final shelter, his final prison. The man who had shouted from grand stages, who had commanded armies across the continent, now sat bent and frail at a simple table, surrounded by maps that no longer mattered. It was April 29th, the beginning of the last day of his life. Outside, the Red Army was closing in from every direction. Every gun, every soldier, every tank pointed toward the heart of Berlin. Hitler knew it. The sound of the shells was the soundtrack of his final hours. Yet he refused to leave. He had already told his closest followers that he would not be captured alive. He had seen what happened to Mussolini in Italy. He would never allow such humiliation. The bunker itself was a strange place. It was not large, only a few rooms connected by narrow corridors. There was a conference room, a dining space, and Hitler's private quarters, which were surprisingly plain for a man who had once controlled vast treasures. The walls dripped with moisture. A generator provided weak light, but often it failed, and candles had to be used. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, not just from the lack of fresh air but from the sense of doom that hung over everyone inside. By this time, Hitler was no longer the strong figure his propaganda once showed to the world. His hands shook constantly. His body was thin and weak, and his hair had turned grey. He moved slowly, dragging his feet as if each step cost him great effort. His eyes, once filled with fire and energy, were now sunken and tired. He looked like an old man who had lost everything but pride. Yet, in conversations, his voice could still rise with anger, blaming generals, blaming the German people, blaming everyone except himself. That morning, he made a decision that surprised even those closest to him. He decided to marry Eva Braun. Eva had been with him for many years, a quiet woman who rarely appeared in public. She was 33, much younger than him, and she had lived most of her life in the shadow of his power. She had chosen to remain with him in the bunker even when escape was possible. Now, knowing the end was near, Hitler finally agreed to make her his wife. The wedding was small and strange. It took place in the bunker's dining room with only a few people present. A government official was brought down to perform the ceremony. The sound of distant explosions could be heard above them as vows were exchanged. There were no flowers, no music, no celebrations. Just a short ceremony in a damp underground room, followed by a modest meal of sandwiches and wine. After the wedding, Hitler and Eva sat together. Not as a royal couple but as two doomed figures facing the end of the world they had built. Afterward, Hitler dictated his last political will and testament. He spoke for hours to his secretary, Traudl Young, who typed his words faithfully. In this final document, he blamed the Jews for the war, cursed his generals for betraying him, and declared that he had been misunderstood by history. He appointed new leaders to replace him, though he knew they would have no power once he was gone. It was the voice of a man still clinging to his illusions while everything around him collapsed. Meanwhile, life inside the bunker continued in a surreal way. Officers, secretaries, and guards moved quietly through the narrow hallways. Some tried to distract themselves with jokes or small talk. Others simply stared at the floor, lost in thought. Food was scarce, and many meals consisted of simple pasta or canned goods. In the evenings, those who still had energy gathered in the small lounge where music played softly from a gramophone. But even there, the tension was unbearable. Everyone knew death was only hours away. Hitler himself spent much of the day talking to his generals. He demanded reports that no longer made sense. He ordered divisions to move that did not exist. His mind was slipping between reality and fantasy. Some generals nodded in silence, too afraid to argue. Others simply left the room, knowing there was no point. The great leader who once inspired millions was now a man shouting at maps that showed nothing but defeat. Eva tried to comfort him. She smiled, laughed lightly, and spoke of small things, as if pretending life was still normal. She wore a simple black dress, and on her finger now was a wedding ring. She had accepted her fate without fear. While others in the bunker whispered about escape, she told everyone she would not leave him. In her calmness, there was something almost haunting. As if she had already made peace with death. Above the bunker, the garden was destroyed. Trees were torn apart, craters scarred the ground, and smoke rose from burning buildings nearby. The sound of Russian guns grew louder with every passing hour. The city was surrounded. The once mighty Third Reich was in its final breath. Yet below, Hitler still dreamed of miracles. He spoke of armies that would push back the Russians, of alliances that would somehow save him. But no miracle came. Only the steady thud of artillery shells answered his words. That night, as April slipped into its final hours, Hitler gathered his inner circle for a last meeting. He told them of his decision. He would end his life before the enemy could take him. He advised others to do the same if they wished. Some nodded silently, others cried. A few still begged him to try to escape, to fly south to Bavaria or even attempt to negotiate. But he refused. His destiny, he said, was here in Berlin, in the ruins of the city. The bunker grew even quieter after that. People walked the halls in whispers. Some wrote farewell letters. Others drank heavily, trying to numb the fear. Outside, the Soviet troops were only a few blocks away. The ground shook again and again with each shell. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets above. It felt as if the whole city was sinking into the earth, and deep underground, Adolf Hitler sat in his small room with Eva Braun, waiting for the morning that would be his last. The morning came with no light. In the bunker, it was always the same, heavy concrete above, electric lamps burning weakly, and the low rumble of explosions from the city. But this morning was different. Everyone inside felt it. The end was no longer an idea. It was here. The Soviet soldiers were already pushing through the streets just blocks away. The air shook constantly. Dust fell from the ceilings as shells landed nearby. Adolf Hitler did not sleep much that night. When dawn broke, he called his staff together one last time. He looked pale, tired, and broken, but his voice was steady. He thanked them for their service, told them to try to escape if they wished, and repeated his decision: he would take his own life before the day was done. No one argued anymore. They only listened. Some wept quietly, others stood stiffly, unable to speak. Eva Braun was calm. She moved through the bunker smiling at people, offering small words of comfort. She seemed lighter, almost relieved, as if she had been waiting for this moment and had finally accepted it. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a dark dress, simple and neat. To her friends, she whispered that she did not regret staying with him, not for a moment. She had had opportunities to leave, but she never took them. Now, she was determined to share his fate completely. Hitler had given instructions for what would happen after his death. His body and Eva's were not to be left for the Soviets. He had seen photographs of Mussolini's body hanging in the streets of Milan, insulted and spit upon by crowds. That, he said, would never happen to him. Their bodies would be burned immediately in the garden above the bunker. His aides had already prepared the gasoline. Before retreating to his private quarters, Hitler shared a final meal with a few close companions. It was a simple lunch of spaghetti and vegetable dishes. He ate quietly, almost without appetite. Others tried to speak, but the words hung in the air awkwardly. Everyone knew it was their leader's last meal. Some drank heavily, trying to fight off the dread that grew heavier with each hour. After lunch, he walked slowly down the hallway with Eva beside him. They entered their small private room. The door closed behind them. Those outside waited in silence, staring at the walls, listening for the sound they all knew was coming. Minutes passed. The silence was unbearable. Then came a sharp crack from inside the room, the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. The smell of bitter chemicals followed almost immediately. Eva had swallowed poison. Hitler had put the pistol to his head. Together, they were gone. The people waiting outside froze. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the aides opened the door. Inside, Hitler sat slumped on a sofa. A pistol lay on the floor. Eva's body was beside him, still and quiet. It was the end. The man who had once ruled almost all of Europe was now a lifeless figure in a dim underground room. Quickly, as ordered, the aides lifted the bodies. They carried them up the narrow staircase and out into the ruined garden. The sky above was grey and full of smoke. Shells still exploded nearby, shaking the earth, but they had no choice. They laid the two bodies on the ground, poured gasoline over them, and set them on fire. Flames rose high, licking the broken walls around them. For a moment, the bodies were visible, then they became shapes in the fire, swallowed by the heat. The guards stood watching, some saluting, others turning their faces away. It was not a funeral, not a ceremony, just a hurried burning in the middle of war. Inside the bunker, the silence deepened. People whispered to one another, wondering what to do now. Some followed Hitler's example and prepared to end their lives. Cyanide capsules were passed around. A few used them immediately. Others chose pistols. Some simply sat in shock, waiting for the Soviets to arrive. Each person carried their own fear, their own private choice of whether to face capture or escape into death. The hours after Hitler's death were filled with chaos. Orders were meaningless now. The German armies outside Berlin were already collapsing. The city itself was falling street by street. Soviet soldiers moved like a tide through the ruins, shouting, firing, throwing grenades into basements. The once proud boulevards were littered with rubble and bodies. Civilians ran in terror, trying to find shelter. Fires burned everywhere, filling the air with black smoke. In the bunker, the walls shook constantly from nearby explosions. Water dripped from cracks in the ceiling. The smell of smoke and death grew stronger. Yet some people still clung to routine. Secretaries typed out documents no one would ever read. Guards stood at their posts, though there was nothing left to guard. It was as if they were caught in a dream, unable to accept reality. Word of Hitler's death spread quickly. To some in the bunker, it brought relief. To others, despair. A few officers still spoke of fighting on, of organizing resistance, but the words sounded empty. Everyone knew the war was over. The Reich was gone. The leader who had promised 1,000 years of glory had ended it all in a small room with a gun and a vial of poison. Above ground, the Soviets pushed closer. They captured the Reichstag, raising their red flag high above the ruins. Gunfire echoed across the city. The sound of celebration mixed with the cries of the defeated. For Berliners who had suffered through years of war and fear, the end was both terrifying and strangely quiet. They knew the nightmare was finished, but the cost was unbearable. Back in the bunker, those who remained faced their own choices. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, refused to surrender. He and his wife poisoned their 6 children with cyanide, then took their own lives. Others tried to slip out into the city, hoping to escape through the ruins. Few made it far. Many were captured by Soviet troops within hours. As night fell, the bunker was no longer a command center but a tomb. The lights flickered. The air was heavy with smoke, gunpowder, and grief. Those still alive sat in silence, waiting for the inevitable knock on the steel doors. And when it finally came, the war that had begun with Hitler's dreams of empire ended with Soviet boots echoing in the dark hallways of his final shelter. The last 24 hours of Adolf Hitler's life were not a grand exit, not a dramatic battlefield death, but a slow collapse into despair, paranoia, and silence. The man who once commanded millions died as a fugitive in his own city, hiding underground, consumed by his own hatred and fear. His death did not stop the war immediately, but it marked the end of an era of terror. The world above the bunker would never be the same again, and so, in those final hours, Berlin itself became a grave. The flames that burned in the garden were not only for 2 bodies but for the dream of 1,000-year Reich that lasted barely more than a decade. History often remembers beginnings, the rise of leaders, the speeches, the victories. But sometimes it is in the endings that we see the true story. Hitler's last day was not a moment of power, not a symbol of strength, but a picture of weakness, despair, and loss. It is a reminder that even the most feared figures can fall, and that in the end, history is written not by their dreams but by their downfall. I share stories like this every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.